Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, welcome to our virtual international workshop entitled EU Trade Policy, Democratic, Transparent, Sustainable, and Geopolitical ? Which is organized by the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies of KU Leuven, of which I have the pleasure to be the director. And in this opening session, I would like to briefly frame and introduce the key objectives of today's workshop, today's and tomorrow's workshop. First of all, this workshop is being organized within the framework of two Horizon 2020 projects. One is RECONNECT, of which our center is the coordinator, and the other project is GLOBE, where we are one of the main partners. Both projects are supported by the European Commission. The aim of this workshop is actually twofold. And it has to do, of course, with the projects that I just mentioned and which have inspired this initiative. So let me recall this. RECONNECT, the first Horizon 2020 project that I mentioned, is a 4-year multidisciplinary research project, and the full name is Reconciling Europe with its Citizens Through Democracy and Rule of Law, which is aimed at understanding and also providing solutions to some recent challenges faced by the European Union, especially when it comes to the rule of law and democracy. We are actually explicitly focusing in that project on trying to restore and strengthen the European Union's legitimacy, especially through democracy and rule of law. And we are also trying, and we're working hard on that right now, to make a new narrative for Europe, hopefully enabling the EU to become better attuned to the expectations of its citizens. Our project runs until the end of April next year, so we still hopefully have a little bit of time for developing this new narrative. Within that context, the first aim of today's and tomorrow's workshop is basically to carry forward the conversation of the legitimacy challenges for the trade policy of the European Union, and notably also trying to find, if you wish, ways to strengthen the democratic credentials of the European Union's common commercial policy. That's the first objective. The second objective links to the other Horizon 2020 project that I mentioned, that's the GLOBE project. GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and the opportunities for the EU in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with a specific attention to key areas that are of strategic importance to the European Union, such as trade, development, security, migration, climate change, and global finance. So this project, this Horizon 2020 project called GLOBE, aims to identify the major roadblocks in ensuring effective global governance, but also it aims at equipping European policymakers with the tools they will need to ensure a more coherent global governance strategy. And on that basis, the second aim of this workshop is to understand better the evolving role of the European Union in an increasingly fragmented global trade governance environment. The global turn to protectionism, the use of trade policy to respond and to meet certain non-trade policy governance goals. And so over the next 2 days, we hope to deepen our understanding of the complex and new set of challenges and opportunities faced by the EU's international trade policy. And to do this, we have invited a really excellent group of researchers from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds who will share with us their current research to help us unravel some of the crucial questions surrounding this policy domain. One such crucial question could be, how should we analyze and reassess the EU as a global trade power, its ability to promote free trade, along with sustainable development and human rights, in light notably of a changed geo-economic and geopolitical context. If we consider the broader context of the so-called poly-crisis faced by the European Union today, consistent and effective action across these related but sometimes conflicting aims seems a tall order indeed, a state of affairs which is actually not unique to trade policy, but one that becomes especially relevant considering the special role the EU plays in shaping its outcomes. There are three main clusters of issues which combined do offer and can offer a picture of the current state of poly-crisis. And let me explain. The first cluster relates to the position of the EU as a global trade actor and the implementation of its evolving trade policy and strategy within a global economic order that is essentially in flux. So that's the first cluster. I will come back to that in a moment, the EU and its global trade strategy. The second cluster captures the bottom-up contestation, which is targeting trade policy in the European Union and related matters of democracy, legitimacy, and transparency, which have become fairly central to the trade policy debate as of late. So that's cluster 2 in our workshop, legitimacy, transparency, and politicization. Finally, the third cluster comprises some of today's era-defining challenges: COVID-19, climate change, sustainable development, and others. So that's what we call cluster 3, new challenges. Let me elaborate a little bit more on those three clusters and maybe raise some questions that may be interesting for our further discussions during the coming panels in our workshop. First of all, cluster 1, the EU and its global trade strategy. For more than a decade, the EU has been pursuing a trade strategy, not only based on its economic interests, but also supporting what I would call an international political agenda, fostering human rights, social and safety standards, environmental protection, sustainable development, and good governance. At the same time, the Union has faced criticism of only paying lip service to many of these non-trade issues, a mismatch which earned it the epithet of a conflicted trade power, end of quote. How capable is the European Union in navigating these often conflicting objectives while aiming to promote free trade and fair trade? Because the EU treaties, as you know very well, speak about free and fair trade. The European Commission's latest policy review for an open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy points to a new, less naive approach. It focuses on what is called open strategic autonomy, which combines, and I quote, assertively defending the EU's interests, protecting the EU's economy from unfair trade practices, with the other already mentioned values such as sustainability, fairness, and rules-based cooperation. So its aims are to project the EU as a global norm maker by leading the way, for example, on regulatory cooperation, on promotion of sustainable value chains, and on the reform of the big multilateral framework that is the World Trade Organization. However, the jury is still out on whether this shift in discourse will translate in momentous changes regarding the role that the EU plays globally. The emphasis on renewed efforts to ensure the enforcement of trade agreements is promising. What is certain is the increasing geopoliticization of trade and the new global contenders to powers in the area of trade, starting, of course, from the largest trading nation in the world, China. Now, Are we witnessing a European Union that is reactive in the face of these trends? Or do new developments like the Biden administration in the United States open the way for a leadership role of the European Union as a norm maker and as a reformer of sometimes outdated trade governance structures? Big question mark. These are some of the key questions that we should indeed be exploring. Let me also flag the great recent dynamics of the transatlantic relations with the recent first meeting in Pittsburgh of the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the United States. Cluster 2, legitimacy, transparency, and politicization. Alongside a global economic order in flux, the European Commission's common commercial policy has been met with increased attention across a broadening set of stakeholders, often resulting in highly polarized debates on EU free trade agreements that are currently being negotiated. These developments have served to highlight how, especially in those areas of wide-ranging European competences like trade, citizens often feel disconnected from decision-making processes and debates in Brussels. You hear the theme of the RECONNECT project popping up again. Bridging this particular gap, which has been called very famously the capabilities expectations gap, bridging this particular gap is no easy feat. In the eyes of many, thus far, the European Union has fallen short in living up to the expectations of its citizens when it comes to democratic accountability and legitimacy. There are maybe two key trends worth mentioning here. On the one hand, as the protests of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jerseys, symbolizes, for some, concerns over international trade are linked to their own domestic challenges, such as unemployment, inequality, and I would add today, the incredible steep rise of energy prices. Although international trade can create jobs, it can also destroy jobs. And those hit by this trend vocally oppose further liberalization of trade. On the other hand, new generations of cosmopolitans view climate change and sustainability as far more important than pursuing free trade agreements. So in this particular context, in this cluster, we will discuss this further. The EU is confronted with a rather hostile domestic environment in pursuing an ambitious trade policy. And the latest, if you wish, developments, including regarding the EU-Mercosur agreement, including regarding the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China, bear witness to that. Cluster 3 then, new challenges. The Union as a global actor faces a unique set of challenges which are intimately connected to its international trade policy. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the EU's dependence on value chains involving third countries, also when it comes to many strategic and essential products. Some have argued that this requires a change of paradigm in how we develop trade policy and define our trade interests. The pandemic has made us hugely aware of our vulnerabilities. But what this new paradigm may consist of is far less clear. I already mentioned China. A key new challenge will also be how to deal with such economic powers, such major economic powers like China. I already mentioned the CAI, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement with China, where the discussions show the sensitivities and the difficulties which emerge. Also the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive investments of China in Europe, the increasing leadership of China in digital technologies areas and other innovations, all of that generate challenges for the European Union. And so the EU's approach in its trade strategy should be placed in an increasingly assertive global strategic outlook in which China plays a key role. How to deal with China, which, as you will remember, has recently been defined by the EU as simultaneously in certain policy areas a cooperation partner, a negotiation partner, an economic competitor, but also a systemic rival, quote unquote. That will indeed bring with us many new challenges. And as we know, opinions in Europe in that sense are not necessarily all along the same lines as opinions in the United States. To address these challenges, in its own words, the EU needs to become more assertive. Greater assertiveness translates into new strategic objectives like the fight against climate change. But think also of sustainable development, the digital agenda, the greening of the economies. All of these are front and center in the recent trade policy documents of the EU. To what degree this stronger assertiveness will materialize is still an open question. It is probably too early to answer, but we might be able to identify some challenges ahead. And I would just hope that some of our panelists will also be engaging in some interesting discussions about what we can expect from the COP26 in Glasgow later this month and beginning of November. So dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, I hope that these early brief reflections will help to spark fruitful and emerging and engaging sessions discussing all these important matters at our workshop. We did receive many interesting paper proposals based on our call for papers, and we really look forward to learning from your insights and ongoing research. Today's two panels will focus first of all on trade policy and global strategy, and the second on the topic of dealing with contested partners. But please do also join us tomorrow from 1:15 p.m. Brussels time, CEST, onwards for the third and for the fourth panels, entitled respectively, Governing Through Trade, COVID-19, Environment and Arms, and the fourth panel, Politicization and Democratization of Trade Policy. Finally, tomorrow at 3:30 p.m., we will also welcome Professor Alasdair Young from the Georgia Institute of Technology, who will join us as a final keynote speaker with a speech entitled, It's the End of EU Trade Policy as We Know It, the Commission's 2021 Trade Policy Review. Dear colleagues, students, I wish you all the very best and extremely interesting discussions during this online workshop. It is now my great pleasure to hand over all powers to our great colleague and friend who is already visible here with a globe in the background, couldn't be more timely and topical, Professor Kolja Raube, who will be chairing the first panel. Kolja, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these opening words, Professor Wouters. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much to everybody who has already tuned in. I know that some of you are actually right now on the other side of the Atlantic, and it's rather early there. So good morning to all of you who are following us actually on the other side of the Atlantic, and good evening to all of you who are following us rather from the East. It's wonderful to see so many of you here around the table. Let me be short and thank especially our three paper givers for being with us. Actually, it's much more. It's three papers, but many more paper givers to be with us for the first panel, Trade Policy and Global Strategy, which is obviously becoming a very, very important question of EU trade policy. You have heard already that the theme of the workshop is EU trade policy, democratic, transparent, sustainable, and geopolitical ? The question is indeed, how do you bring all of these perspectives into one global strategy, and how does such a strategy show in special relationships with partners around the world. To this end, I think we will hear some answers from the different papers in our first panel. And I would like to present them to you, the paper givers and the papers, before we start. The first paper is EU-India Strategy of Connectivity and Cooperation in the South Asian Neighbourhood, a neglected region or a rising pole of power. The authors are Sanches, Siqueira, Campos, and actually Gustavo Mueller. And I very much welcome you to our panel. Andre is situated at the graduate program Santiago Dantas, and in fact at the Faculty of Social Sciences here at KU Leuven. And Gustavo Mueller is also from KU Leuven. Welcome to both of you. Then we have a second paper, the EU Strategic Autonomy in Times of Politicization of Trade Politics, What Future for Accountable Multilateralism, by Professor Dr. Wolfgang Weiß. Welcome, and welcome especially to you for this paper, which we are very much looking forward to. Wolfgang Weiß is Professor of European Law and Public International Law at the University of Speyer. And then last but not least, we have a co-chaired paper, a co-authored paper by Dr. Johan Eliasson and Dr. Patricia Garcia-Duranue from East Stroudsburg University and the University of Barcelona. Their paper is entitled New is Old, Managed Globalization and the Open, Sustainability and Assertive EU Trade Policy. So as you can see already from the titles of the paper, we really have three papers that are focusing on global strategy, nevertheless from very different perspectives. And I'm very interested to see how these three papers come together. Let's start with the first paper by Andre and Gustavo. Every set of paper givers has 12 minutes, so I will keep the time. And I would first of all think that we go and listen to all three presentations, and afterwards have actually comments, questions, and then the answers from the paper givers. So up to you, Andre and Gustavo.
Thanks, Kola. Before I pass on to Andre, let me just try to share the screen here, which is basically my task during the presentation. I believe you now can see it. Let me know if you don't.
Yes, we can.
See it. And before I start, can you hear me well? Just to make sure.
We do, Andre, we do.
Okay, thank you, thank you. All right. Yes. Can I get started?
You can certainly do that.
All right, thank you. So good afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity of presenting our research and congratulate everyone involved in the organization of Reconnecting Global Workshop, organizers, moderators, panelists, and the audience. So this is the title of our research, the EU in the Strategy of Connectivity and Cooperation South Asian Neighbourhood, a neglected region or a rising pole of power. I would like to start with introducing the region of South Asia. So what is the South Asia? Conflict incidents. It's a region that is full of conflicts incidents. So South Asia international relations has been neglected for many years and was never on the European bloc's external action priorities. That's because the majority of countries has a low international insertion and little economic expression. South Asia is a region that is historically conflicted and poorly integrated, where security issues overlap development issues. So with the emergency of what Acharya says, Asian century, this region has been showing economic growth and gaining international projection driven by the rise of China and India, and more recently by the security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. On the third slide, with that in mind, on the third slide, we have our objective, that is to explain the instruments of connectivity of the European Union global strategy through the case study of South Asia by researching the following overarching question. Has the engagement of the European Union South Asia through its international trade policy and development assistance been perceived to meet non-trade governance goals? Our hypothesis starts by saying that the capacity of the EU's normative power to translate its global strategy in political influence is still limited due to the European bloc's low presence in the security dynamics of South Asia. And besides that, the existence of limited political will and bureaucratic obstacles within European institutions impose difficulties to expand cooperation and connectivity initiatives. The EU is mostly seen as a major trading partner with development assistance cooperation for South Asian countries. On the next slide, it's related, what are the benefits of cooperation and connectivity for EU in South Asia? Well, mostly is to deepen cooperation with South Asia could potentially benefit the European Union of tackling some current stress factors, such as the terrorism, mostly security factors. So they are, in order to meet non-trade goals, that the European Union tries to approach South Asia region. Given the context presented, we have in mind that the EU development policy with the global South as a whole, and more specifically the South Asia, tends to fall into the relationship of norms versus interests. These contextual changes induce the creation of new connectivity instruments without modifying the general objectives of the European policy. EU policies towards South Asia can be understood as an European response and also an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. On our next slide, we're talking about the theoretical framework in the case of South Asia. That is, that in this case is the both governance through trade and diffusion of norms are the main elements that contributing for the understanding of the term connectivity. So enforcing regulation through its legal institutions and generate the standards of production and conducting the legal framework brings about a Europeanization of important aspects of the global trade, with Bradford in her book defines as a Brussels effect. But it's important to emphasize that acceptance of a given norm does not make European Union normative power. It's important predisposition to act in a normative way in world politics. And you have several ways to dispose those normative powers. So here we have some frameworks that the bloc is carried out in different ways of norm diffusion that European Union tries to normalize in the international relations, such as contagion, information diffusion, procedural diffusion, transference, over diffusion, cultural filter. On their next slides, we're talking more about the limitations of multilateralism to an engaged bilateralism. So the priority of the European Union is actually the ASEAN and not the SAARC. And what is not the SAARC? It's because the weak level of South Asian integration, as well as the tension and historical conflicts that shape the region, make it difficult for the European Union's political initiatives traditionally oriented towards a multilateral and interregional approach. So with that in mind, on our next slide, so it becomes more effective for the European Union to establish its bilateral relation, strengthening its strategic partnership with India, that is considered not only a rising power, economic power, but also the SAARC's policymaker. On our right side, we have some data about the importance of the trade relations between the European Union and South Asian countries. On our next slide, the strategic partnership between the European Union and India is based on the rule-based global order, which approaches the promotion of the rule of law, multilateralism, trade and economic cooperation, climate change, democracy, and human rights. But an important aspect is that international cooperation is difficult in practice and reduce the strategic partnership to a dialogue. So basically, the strategic relationship between European Union and India is related to trade, in which India benefits from preferential tariffs. And before the Brexit, EU used to be the main trading partner of India. Post Brexit, EU became the third largest trading partner. So it also affects the narrative of the European Union, say the importance of the trade and economic cooperation. On our next slide, so on the next slide, we're talking about the new release in September now of 2021, the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So since the lack of presence in the security issues of the European Union in South Asia, the EU, this recent release strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is a way of the European Union try to show more engagement with the security issues in that region, in the mentioned region, but also aims to contribute to the region's stability, security, and prosperity, which also, of course, promotes the principle of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and international law. On the next slide,
Andre, you have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. So I'm going to the conclusions already. That is the next slide, please. So basically, the conclusion is that the complex of regional context is shaped by historical conflicts, imposes limits on Brussels policies to advance its presence in South Asia. Since the EU is also a regional legal framework, there seems to be a cautious interest from Brussels to increase its relation beyond trade and development assistance in South Asia. Once these connectivity instruments prove to be manageable to achieve some of the European goals. So the EU's efforts to align trade policy with development objectives through initiatives like Everything But Arms, the generalized system of preferences and development has been raised critics from countries of South Asia during the imposition of the EU agenda. The last slides with the conclusions is that despite of the improvement of the political practices, the actions of the European Union's bloc continue to be challenged by problems of collective coordination. And the dialogue between the EU and the India is still lacks more substantial initiatives that do not go further and more beyond trade. So especially with regard to the lack of the European engagement in the security architecture. With the launch of the European Union strategy for the Indo-Pacific, it represents an advance in the security dynamics, but recent disagreements involving nuclear submarines and the signing of the AUKUS that we saw on the media recently, in the context of the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad, signals that political challenges that EU will face in the coming years to establish itself as a more relevant actor in Asia and in the current geopolitical competition? Thank you very much, Professor Colha. Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Andre, to you indeed. And thank you for this very good and very well-structured presentation. You kept the time, and I'm sure it raises a lot of questions. I was looking into your conclusions, and the imposition of the EU agenda is certainly something that we may have to discuss during the Q&A, because I'm pretty sure that we will hear more about that in other contributions to come. With that being said, I would like to give the floor now to Professor Weiß from the University of Speyer, not very far away from Belgium, actually. Professor Weiß, would you like to share a PowerPoint, or are you just taking the time like this? You have 12 minutes.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Nadia has my slides already, and I'm sure she's prepared to display them now. Screen sharing has started. Yes, exactly. So we go to slide 1, please. That is not the first one. Yes, okay. So the EU's strategic autonomy in times of politicization of trade relations, what future for accountable multilateralism? So that's my topic. And the background, of course, is that trade relations are under constant stress since several years due to simultaneous fundamental economic, institutional, political, technological shifts in world trade. The long-standing transatlantic cooperation has been shattered, and new actors, above all China, are trying to significantly determine the development of international politics and trade relations. In the midst of all these, the European Commission has committed itself to a geopolitical role. And as a consequence, it has also changed its trade policy under the motto or the leitmotif of an open strategic autonomy towards a more assertive policy of enforcing its trade rights and protecting against unfair practices. So the assertiveness turn meets with concerns. Internally, the new turn raises demands for a more accountable Commission, as the new tools will enlarge its decision-making leeway. And externally, the EU's trade policy shift may be blamed for neglecting multilateralism. So please, next slide. My contribution will first, slide 2, please, not 3, will first remind to the general background about politicization, and then I have a brief look to the EU's turn towards more assertiveness before I elaborate more on the concerns and challenges. So next slide, please. Now we come to slide 3. Trade relations face a rise of unilateralism and protectionism. The WTO and its dispute settlement have become contested as never before. Climate change, public health, digitization become ever more important for trade regulation. Trade relations are also confronted with an increasing geo-economic orientation. China, as mentioned, challenges trade rules with its, it uses its state capitalism strategically for a conscious geo-economic behavior to systematically expand its market position. And these developments, together with a focus, which is already well known, on non-tariff barriers and the rising importance of non-trade issues for trade regulation, all this together led to a greater politicization of trade issues. Now, next slide, please. Let's have a very brief look to this new assertiveness turn, as I call it. In face of these unprecedented developments, the EU too felt forced to rely more on unilateral measures to ward off unfair treatment. The EU's commitment to multilateralism has now been embedded in an open strategic autonomy within a more assertive trade policy approach that defends its economic interests, its values and objectives. And with its new approach, the EU wants to reap the benefits of a rules-based trade while having the right tools to more robustly enforce its trade rights and to protect a level playing field. So this new turn is already in full swing. The EU is stepping up its instruments to enforce its trade rights more effectively. The EU has instigated new legislative initiatives and amended recently the trade enforcement regulation to expand the scope for countermeasures. The EU has also drafted several new tools for ensuring a level playing field, such as the proposal for a regulation on foreign subsidies distorting the internal market. There is more, but I have to confine myself to the last two mentioned. So next slides. Next slide, please. Let's have a look to the internal and external concerns. The orientation of the trade policy faces reservation. Internally, the concerns relate to the balance of powers between EU institutions. The new rules will give the Commission considerable new powers, as they might restrict trade relations with third countries. They may produce foreign policy effects about which to decide should be in the hands of the Council. And the question is, of course, where is the Parliament in all of this? Externally, the EU could be blamed for neglecting its multilateral policy approach, for turning to increased unilateralism and escalating trade conflicts even more. Internal and external concerns are interrelated, as strengthened scrutiny over the Commission may ensure that new powers are not used for protectionism. Next slide, please. I will now address the accountability issue. With the Lisbon Treaty, as you know, the power of the Parliament was brought forward with regard both to treaty making and the adoption of basic regulations in trade policy. So the Parliament became equal or almost equal to the Council. This picture, however, changes when looking at implementation. The basic regulations authorize the Commission to take implementing measures. This gives the Commission considerable power to determine trade policy measures. And in doing so, the Commission is subject to limited supervision by Parliament and Council. The control powers of the Parliament are particularly scarce, as it's not part of the comitology mechanism. The Parliament can only notify that a draft implementing act exceeds the mandate provided for in the Basic Act. And even then, the Commission can still maintain its draft implementing act. The Parliament cannot force the Commission to reassess measures in view of its strategic implications. The lack of control by the legislative is even more serious when the leeway of the Commission is expanded and when the Commission gets comprehensive new powers. And these new tools, which are envisaged now in the reorientation of trade policy, grant considerable flexibility to the Commission in adopting countermeasures and could be used for protectionism or might unduly affect trade. The decision-making by the Commission now will go beyond mere technicalical issues, all the more as it takes place in times of contested trade relations and geopolitical rivalries. I will illustrate this with two examples. And now please forward to the next slide. The recent amendment of the trade enforcement regulation allows for the use of sanctions when trade partners block a dispute settlement. This applies in particular when a WTO panel upholds an EU claim and the other country, party to the appeal, appeals to the inactive appellate body. Then dispute settlement is blocked, all the more as the other country may not participate in the EU's alternative interim appeal mechanism. The adoption of countermeasures by the Commission then requires comprehensive assessments about their necessity for EU interest and about non-cooperation of the other party. The Comitology Committee can block the adoption of a Commission draft countermeasure, but the Commission then can consult to the Appeal Committee, which can block the measure only with a qualified majority, which is difficult to reach. It rarely happens. So more or less, the Commission can go forward. Another example is another example of new comprehensive powers with broad leeway for the Commission is the draft regulation on foreign subsidies. This regulation is about ensuring the level playing field in the EU as regards competition from companies which received foreign subsidies. These subsidies may improve the competitive position of the beneficiary companies. for example, in case of investment or public procurement in the EU. The new powers will allow the Commission to accept commitments of the company or to impose repressive measures. In adopting such decisions, the Commission has to undertake in-depth investigations about the presence of third country subsidies, about distortion of competition, and about the determination of impact. The Commission is also required to balance the negative effects of a foreign subsidy with positive effects on the development of economic activities in the EU. So very complex analyses are required from the Commission. And in adopting such decisions, the comitology again applies, but the Commission is subject only to the advisory procedure, which actually contradicts the comitology regulation that provides for the application of the examination procedure. The advisory procedure gives no effective influence to the member state representatives. The Commission thus effectively is uncontrolled in its decision-making here, even though it exercises comprehensive powers in a highly politicized context. The Commission justifies the choice of advisory powers by reference to the very low role the member states play in competition policy. One may, however, question whether this does justice to the significance of Commission decision-making powers under the new instrument. The new regulation breaks novel ground, interferes considerably with the activities of foreign companies and also with third countries. The decision-making process does not make room for considering possible trade conflicts and the consequences for trade relations. So compared even to trade defense and the amendment which I just spoke about, the Commission's leeway under the new regulation, which is proposed now, is even less controlled. So these examples illustrate the considerable leeway the Commission enjoys and the expanded powers it has, whereas the Commission's accountability appears to be reduced, and the Parliament is almost completely left out in the code. And, next slide, please. This lack of scrutiny is even more deplorable as the new tools jeopardize the constitutional duty to respect international obligations. So with regards to the amendment to the trade enforcement regulation, I will cut it short here to keep in time. We can really see that this new trade enforcement regulation, as far as WTO dispute settlement is concerned, is actually in breach of WTO rules. The new rules, rather the exclusive character of WTO dispute settlement, because they allow for unilateral countermeasures while a WTO dispute is still pending. And the same applies actually to the draft regulation on foreign subsidies. Also here we have, at least in particular context, a breach of WTO rules. And beyond the mere legal issues, we have also to consider the political implications of the EU's policy instruments which were announced. The unilateral introduction of new tools without international dialogue is likely to increase other WTO members' resistance to the new rules. And this may lead again to a retaliatory spiral. It may furthermore invite other WTO members to emulate EU practice, and it will further damage the already endangered international trading system in the WTO, so all of which undermines the credibility of the EU as a last standing multilateralist. So let me come to the conclusion now. Last
Wonderful,
slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, the redirection of trade policy adds to the contestation of trade rules. It conflicts with its multilateral stance and with the constitutional grounded application of the EU to respect international obligations. And thirdly, it calls for greater accountability of the Commission. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiß, for this presentation. Very interesting presentation that raises a lot of questions, and I'm sure we will have them. Let me remind everybody, panelists, but also attendees, you can write your questions in the chat. We will collect your questions, and we will immediately go to the questions and answers, the comments from all of you after the last presentation. And it's my real pleasure to welcome now Patricia Garcia Duran-Huet to this panel, and also Johan Eliasson, who Both of you, I guess, will present your paper now for the next 12 minutes. New is old, ? Manage globalization and the open, sustainable and assertive EU trade policy. Basically a continuation, I guess, of what we have heard. Assertiveness is the word of the day. It's your turn.
Yes, so I'm going to handle the slide transition, but Patricia is going to start out with the heavy lifting of the paper. And I do think it follows very well on the previous paper as well. So Patricia, you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Johan and I are delighted to be able to have this opportunity to share our research with you. Research that indeed quite complements quite well Professor Weiß. The same as our previous presenter, we start by agreeing that we have a turbulent international context with a challenge to the international liberal order. That opens a window of opportunity for the European Union trade policy, the new strategy, the open, sustainable, assertive, the OSA, to change, to have a shift from what it was before, to have to produce a change. And the assertive part in the title seems indeed to indicate that there has been a change. On the other hand, however, both historical and discursive institutionalism remind us that change, and especially hard change, to put it like that, real change, is quite difficult and is rather the exception rather than the rule. So a critical juncture is not to be taken as very quickly. We need to analyze whether this is the case. And this is exactly what we try to do, to try to see to what extent the OSA represents a change from the European Union's liberal trade paradigm. To do so, we propose a methodology based on a historical perspective as well as on paradigms. To be more specific, what we do is to identify the paradigm or paradigms that underlie all the European Union trade strategy from 1999 till the OSA, and we compare them. But to do so, we need to, of course, next slide, please. We need, of course, to define what we understand by a critical juncture in this context. And to do so, what we do is to allocate trade paradigms along an axis, the openness security axis. This axis is justified by the following reasoning. Trade openness leads to trade or more trade, and more trade leads towards interdependence. And interdependence can be seen as negative or as positive. Liberal paradigms tend to see interdependence as positive, not only from the perspective of economic benefits, but also from a security perspective, in the sense that interdependence will prevent conflict or will promote peace. On the other hand, however, we have that the realist paradigms see a trade-off between openness and security, in the sense that for them, interdependence means risk, the risk of dependence. Therefore, we can allocate all the trade paradigms along this axis so that we have the free trade paradigm on the liberal side of the continuum. We have the free trade paradigm closer to total openness, that will be laissez-faire, followed by embedded liberalism and fair trade, which in the European Union, we argue and show in the paper, have been, let's put no merge, but combine into a larger paradigm, which is called managed globalization. On the other side of the continuum, in the realist side, what we have is trade as foreign policy as the paradigm closer to the liberal part of the continuum, and then followed by the Listian and mercantilist, and the mercantilist would be the closest to autarky. By allocating the paradigms in this axis, the definition of critical juncture that appears is that we will only have a critical juncture if there is a shift, but a complete, almost complete shift from the left-hand side, from the liberal part of the continuum to the right-hand side, that is to the realist part of the continuum. That is that we will not consider a critical juncture when we have shifts within one of the ideological bandwidths, nor when we have a partial shift, or in one trade strategy we have that both a liberal paradigm and a realist paradigm are combined. What we need is to have an almost complete shift towards from the liberal to the realist part. Thank you, Johan.
Okay, so how do we do this? Well, so we combine a qualitative and quantitative content analyses. We identify keywords that are associated with the dominant paradigms that we outlined previously, as well as phrases to help contextualize those keywords when we do a qualitative content analysis. The quantitative one, I'll show you the results of, and the qualitative one are supposed to complement each other, and they both show the same general shift over time in the trade strategies that we identify and use. Keywords for each trade paradigm are those primarily associated with them in the existing literature. We haven't taken a specific source for these. We present these keywords in the paper and then use those in the quantitative content analysis, the results of which I will show briefly. The managed globalization paradigm combines the embedded liberalism and fair trade paradigms that have been used in much of the literature before to assess the EU's trade strategy, and which we argue and show in conclusion is better looked at as one combined paradigm after being introduced as a doctrine in 1999. Looking at the quantitative analyses first, we show this shift over time from having a predominance of the managed globalization paradigm, combination of embedded liberalism and fair trade, with the introduction of this in 1999 up through the early 2000s. And you know, Dr. Meunier is here, and we draw on her studies from that time period as well in the qualitative content analyses. And then we see a significant shift in the emphases towards free trade in the subsequent trade strategies, whereas then by 2015, we contextualize this in our paper as well, because of the increased contestation, the politicization of trade policy. Now, this is the context of CETA and TTIP. We see a significant shift back towards the managed globalization paradigm. And then with the OSA, free trade, the expansion of new markets takes a significant backseat to the enforcement of existing rules, fair trade, sustainability, and also asserting the EU's place in this changed international context. So the realist element of trade as foreign policy now significantly shows up in the OSA, very much highlighting what Dr. Weiß also showed in his previous paper. We also do a content similarity assessment between the different strategies, and that shows very consistently the same thing that show up here, that there's much higher similarities between, say, the 2015 and 2021, or 1999 and 2021 strategies than between, say, the 99 and 2006 strategy. And so what we find in the qualitative analyses is also very much the same, that the embedded liberalism in fair trade is present in all trade strategies presented, and we combine them as to represent managed globalization. This is sort of a challenge to the existing literature that has basically dismissed the continuation of these in the trade strategies starting in 2006. We argue that there's a much greater continuity than the existing literature argues. But also that when we come up to the OSA, there is a rebalancing in the emphasis in the trade strategy towards a greater emphasis on trade as foreign policy. I think there's a banner in the way here, but the two contributions to the literature is that we challenge some of the existing literature in saying that the embedded liberalism and fair trade paradigms, as presented in strategies and presented by the Commission from their standpoint, is really a continuation of managed globalization and can be understood as such, and that is more prominent in the literature than heretofore acknowledged, and that there is a significant shift in the emphases by the Commission from sort of the free trade with some managed globalization to trying to balance both the managed globalization paradigm with the realization of having to be more assertive and proactive without emphasizing the expansion of markets, but reinforcing rules, reinforcing fairness in trade. Thus, in this comparative sort of timeline assessment, the OSA is not a definitive rejection of the past. It is a rebalancing of paradigms that doesn't constitute a specific and clear critical junction. It is not explicitly protectionist in the sense that you move towards a clearly Listian or mercantilist position. It is not advocating protectionist policies as a priori policy in terms of closing off markets and just promoting exports, but rather enforcement of existing rules and at the same time ensuring that aspects of managed globalization, labor laws, sustainability, climate change are also enforced. So it's a more assertive way of protecting the fairness and enforcement of rule of law rather than a priori protectionist policy. But I think then to sum up, also I think piggybacking on the previous paper by Dr. Weiß, I think this the difference between protecting and enforcing the rule of law and explicit protectionism can very well spill over towards protectionism. It is possible, but given where we are currently at the OSA compared to the previous trade strategies, that is not what we find.
Thank you very much, Johan and Patricia, for your very, very interesting contribution. I'd like to remind everybody that if you have questions, you can now signal your questions. You can write your questions into the chat or signal to us that you would actually like to raise your question. Can I ask who would like to make a start? I see that Axel Marx has a question. Axel, floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much to all presenters for very interesting papers. I have a question for the last paper. So you focus very much on this paradigm shift and whether that is occurring or not. But I have a related question to you related to the analysis you did. So as you know, the Commission is really very much pursuing, let's say, trade objectives in its trade policy, but also so-called non-trade objectives, rule of law, which you mentioned, climate change, and so on. Do you find any evidence in the text analysis you have done that this balance between trade objectives and non-trade objectives has been shifting, and that the importance of non-trade objectives in EU trade policy is becoming increasingly important? Or don't you find that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Axel, I would suggest that we are collecting a couple of more questions. I see that Gustavo has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kolia. My question is also for the last paper, which I really enjoyed listening to the presentation. My question is, now that we're talking about the growing US-Chinese rivalry and that there is different talk of deglobalization, can we perhaps also foresee that the change in paradigm of EU policy will also happen at different times towards different regions, or is this discussion theoretically and necessarily a global one? Well, that's basically it, right? So can we imagine the EU having a paradigm shift towards a certain country in a certain region and using trade as foreign policy to that region alone, while continue to manage what's left of globalization with other countries and regions?
Thank you very much, Gustavo. I'm looking around whether there are other questions right now. I cannot see that anybody has his hand up. I will add a couple of my questions then to the panel. I have a question for Wolfgang Weiß. I was very fascinated by your presentation. And in fact, if I got it correctly, you're basically arguing in your presentation, in your paper, that it may be the case that actually a lack of control of the European Commission internally may also lead to the fact that in fact there are more protective, market protective forces at play. But how do you rule out that it could actually be the opposite? That actually it could rather be that a lack of control of the European Commission could not perhaps lead to the opposite. I was just curious about that argument that you had in one of your slides, and I thought that was very interesting, but I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And then perhaps for Gustavo and Andre, you mentioned that one of the critical questions is, in fact, to which degree whether we are actually dealing with an imposition of a global agenda of the European Commission towards South to South Asia, and the question is, of course, whether this would necessarily be shared by the Europeans themselves. So how do you actually make sure that this position that you here represent is actually matched with the position of the Europeans that we very often hear? Well, this is not a European agenda, this is a universal agenda, it's a global agenda, right? When we talk about human rights, when we talk about the rule of law, when we talk actually about climate change, this is not a European agenda, this is actually the imposition of universally accepted objectives. So perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that, to which degree this is still a driving argument of the European Union in that respect. And while I've been talking, I see that Johan also wants to comment. Please, it's your question.
Yeah, I also have a question for Wolfgang, and in consideration of time constraints, you can answer it if you have time. But you're talking about how these new trade enforcement or trade defense tools, some of which we mentioned as well, like the anti-subsidy regulation and course of active action regulations, are incompatible with WTO law, and then also mention how the treaties guarantee that the Commission also have to ensure the rule of law and the functioning of the internal market, and that those foundational articles should override other obligations. So I'm just curious if you can elaborate on how you see that panning out in terms of challenges at the WTO vis-a-vis the Commission's response to those challenges.
And in the meantime, we have one more question for Professor Weiß, actually from Katja Ziegler in the chat. She is asking, what do you think the future of the CJEU will be in ensuring accountability of the Commission for EU trade policy measures, both within the EU and for external actors event states, for example, wider standing rules, question mark. So basically the question, what is the role of the court that in trade policy, and how do you see the future in that respect? I suggest that we give Professor Weiß a little bit of time to reflect upon all of these questions. And I suggest that in the order of our presentations, we start the answers as well. Gustavo and Andre, up to you for your answers. Please, not more than 1 to 2 minutes.
Thanks, Colin. I'll try, since Andre presented, I'll try to briefly answer your question. It's a very, I think it's a very important reflection that we must have with a variety of regions around the world, right? And in particular with South Asia. And I think this question of the imposition of values sort of connects with the last presentation that we had in this workshop, which has to do to what extent is that still an objective of the European Union, or will trade be used more as a foreign policy tool to achieve geopolitical goals? So while many regions around the world, and that's not only South Asia, but one can also think of Latin America and Africa, have been, let's say, filtering and adapting that promotional values to their own national context, that might be actually, we might be seeing a change on that end from the side of the European Union as well, as it acknowledges that it can no longer even have that priority, and is now shifting towards a more geopolitical take. But overall, I think that one of the main arguments of the paper is that not only is those non-trade objectives more difficult to achieve in South Asia because of the very conflictual nature of the region, but also that has forced the EU to change its overall strategy, right, from multilateralism to unilateralism, in that sense, forming strategic partnership with the main country in the region, and from that anchoring with India, then moving on to areas that are not particularly related to trade, such as well, that are related but are not trade per se, such as digital innovation, transport, and corporations, health and education, and so on. So I think that the short answer is yes. I mean, there is always this perception in the region of a certain imposition of the agenda, imposition of values, but the change that we see now doesn't necessarily come from the side of the receiving end, but it's more coming on the side of the European Union itself.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for these questions. And Wolfgang Weiß, it's your turn.
Okay, very interesting, very, very broad questions, which are easy to answer in a couple of sentences. So I would give my best. So first of all, to your question, Kolja, well, a lack of control internally. Yes, well, you see, we have these new tools, these new instruments, which will sooner or later become reality, will be adopted. Of course, we have to see in the end how it looks like. But my fear is that you have these new instruments. And of course, if you give an authority, an executive, an instrument, a tool, it will be used. It will be used because there are stakeholders, there are companies behind that. They want to see that these are implemented. And this in itself brings the danger, of course, that the EU more or less slides into some road which leads towards trade defense, protectionism. We have this tool now limited more or less to safeguards and anti-dumping. And what we are looking ahead of us is a bunch of new instruments. And my fear is that, of course, the Commission, without good sound control by Council and Parliament, might be tempted in one situation or the other, not always, but sometimes to adopt decisions which the Commission might not consider sufficiently in order also to look to the long-term consequences and the escalatory effect that might be caused by this. That is my problem, which, at least my fear, yes, which I have. So to Johan's question about WTO versus internal market. Yes, of course, it's also the task of the European Commission to be a safeguard for the functioning of the internal market. And that's why the Commission says, well, we need to organize and to ensure there's a level playing field. And that's why we use these tools for this purpose. But still, the Commission is also under an international, but also European Union constitutional law obligation to respect international obligations. So when we look at the internal market and the necessary required level playing field, we should do this in a way that does not contradict WTO rules. So we have to find a balance, and the instruments which we see now, at least in some directions, in some situations, make me feel that there might be a danger that WTO law might be breached, and well, others, trade partners, will respond accordingly, and then we end up with an escalating trade dispute. It's actually nothing that helps us to ensure a level playing field. Would have been better to discuss some of these new rules with a negotiated with the partners, with the trade partners concerned. But of course, I agree that is a long-term perspective. Of course, the Commission would like to have some tools now ready for it to respond to possible infringements by others. The last question by Katja Siegler. Well, of course, the Court of Justice has an important role to play, but the control is directed and only taken ex post after a decision has been taken. So if you bring a case to the court, there's no suspensive effect. And of course, the companies affected do have a standing. That is already the place. We know it from anti-dumping. It's not a problem, but it will take years. So it's not an effective remedy for them. So the states, the trade partners behind these companies might be challenged to respond more quickly instead of waiting for the Court of Justice, which once might finally say after 2 years, well, this instrument, this decision was not according to the rules. It would maybe more tempting for a trade partner to respond quickly, and then we are in the midst of what we do not like to see, an escalating trade war, so to say. Okay, that was my try to give a quick reply to this very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering with this great depth and knowledge. Thank you so much. And now we have Johan and Patricia for a last round of answers.
Would you like to answer the first one and I do the second?
I was going to let you start, but that's fine. No, of course, we find balancing between trade and non-trade objectives. And part of that is embedded in, or part of the embedded liberalism paradigms that really manifest themselves in the managed globalization paradigm. And these always had non-trade objectives to a certain extent. And if you were to go through the trade strategies, you see them follow very much the same pattern as we identified in both the qualitative and quantitative analyses. But there is always that balance that the EU attempts to do. It's just a greater emphasis today on the assertiveness of enforcing rules with ensuring those other goals of climate stability, labor provisions in the trade strategy, rather than market expansion, market opening.
Yes, and thank you very much for that very interesting question, Gustavo. I will say that you are right in an indirect way, I believe, in the sense that, of course, more than saying that you have different shifts in paradigms directly in the strategy, you have let's put that they do not differentiate perhaps between regions, but on the other hand, of course, this shift will affect differently the different regions. And the use of instruments as well is going to affect differently the different regions. And therefore, at the end of the day, you are absolutely right. there's going to be so some regions that are going to continue to be treated perhaps more from a liberal perspective and others more from a realist perspective. So that's a very interesting point you're making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you for actually not only presenting your very interesting papers, but also for this very interesting discussion. I thought over the last 20 minutes, which we had, bringing really to the table the continuities, but perhaps also the shifts of strategic trade policy in the European Union, the effects that internal dynamics, politics, politicization have on EU trade policy, but also the response towards the larger, greater external pressures, and we may call them also tectonic shifts that we have seen in the context of the contestation of the liberal international order. So thank you so much for actually bringing all of these questions to the table. I think that it was a great kickoff to our upcoming discussions. We have a second panel coming up in 5 minutes, actually, where we will be talking about a follow-up issue dealing with contested partners with 3 really interesting papers, so stay tuned. I would suggest, in order to make it most efficient and to let also our attendees be on time, let's cut the coffee break short. Let's get a quick new coffee, and we meet again in 5 minutes. Thank you so much to all the panelists and for all your questions. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody to this second panel of our workshop. My name is Axel Marx. I also work at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I'm involved in the Globe and the RECONNECT projects. So now we will continue our workshop with a second panel, and we have again 3 wonderful papers lined up. We will first hear from Olia Kalifskaya Whittaker, if I pronounce that correctly. Thank you. On EU's trade strategy for trade with the disputed territories. Then we go to Cornelia Pipidi Kalukiriu, if that's fine, who will present her paper on regulatory dialogue as part of the regulatory cooperation, pushing over the edge constitutional principles. And Cornelia, we just heard earlier from your supervisor, Professor Weiß, that you are finishing the PhD. So good luck with that, but we look very much forward to your presentation. And then finally, we will hear from Professor Sophie Meunier from Princeton University and Sarah Densman from Indiana University on the big screen mapping the diffusion of foreign investment screening and mechanisms. I propose we follow the same logic as we did in the previous panel. So we will first have the presentations, which will be followed by Q&A, and I invite everybody, if they have questions, to type in the questions in the Q&A box, and the other panel members or the other workshop presenters, they can also, of course, raise their hand and ask the question. But we'll first start off with Olia. Olia, if you want to kick off. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint.
Yes, I do actually. May I just try to share it?
There it is.
Yes.
See it very well.
Yes, can you see it okay?
We see it well. So you have approximately 12 minutes.
Great.
Start if you're ready.
Great, awesome. Thank you very much. And also thank you for having me here. It's really great to be back at KU Leuven, only if virtually. And congratulations, it's a really great workshop. I'm really learning a lot and enjoying a lot the presentation and the papers as well. It's really, really great to be here. So my research is actually, it's a work in progress still. It's a part of the research I'm doing on the trade with territories that are occupied, annexed, or otherwise disputed, to which I refer for the sake of simplicity as disputed territories. And disputes where multiple states or non-state entities claim sovereignty over regions or territories are actually pretty common, and perhaps more common than that we think. You may find different maps online which kind of try to illustrate these disputes, which categorize them according to different criteria. This is one of the examples of these maps, admittedly very limited. But from a trade perspective, these disputes are very interesting because the problem is actually under which rules can we trade with these territories, if we can trade with them at all, since there are a lot of since there are competing sovereignty claims on these regions, and since very often the de facto administration is different than the jure administration that you would expect to have. So the territories I'm going to be talking about, and these are the territories in the EU neighborhood, include the Palestinian, I think this is the most famous one, if I may say so, the Palestinian territories in West Bank, which are occupied by Israel, the Turkish Republic and Northern Cyprus, which is well, considers itself the Autonomy Republic in the north of Cyprus, but is not recognized as such by any country apart from Turkey. Western Sahara, the territory which is administered by Morocco, but where Sahrawi people claim sovereignty, Crimea region, which is annexed by Russia since 2014, and the Nagorno-Karabakh region, where the Armenian population pretty dominantly is present, but the region is still under the control of Azerbaijan. So, of course, this list is not exhaustive, and the EU trades with different territories which can be considered disputed. But I chose those ones because they're A, the most relevant, and B, there have been a lot of shifts, including the recent judgments of the European Court of Justice happening in these regions. And even though the trade volumes, the exports, the imports from these territories into the EU are pretty much limited, there are still a lot of interesting issues that arise for the EU role as the global trade actor and also EU legitimacy as a global trade actor and as a supporter of international law. So the question that I have been dealing with for quite some time now is how the EU trade with these territories organized from the perspective of customs law and from the perspective of the technical barriers to trade, so the technical trade rules. And my conclusion is perhaps not really surprising for the audience here, is that there is no common approach in how EU treats these territories and how EU organizes its imports from these territories. Because, for instance, there are different rules, as I will be showing it soon, applied to trade with Israeli settlements on the territories that are Palestinian than for trade with Western Sahara. You see this difference actually pretty much in the case law. So we had recently, a couple of years ago, the case PUC-SP, where the issue at stake was the labeling of wines produced by Israeli companies operating in the occupied territories and whether these wines can be labeled as made in Israel for the purpose of European markets. And the court said that it's actually not allowed, that this wine should be labeled as made in Palestinian territories or made in Israeli settlements and so on and so on. At the same time, there are no similar rules that apply to products imported from Western Sahara. So you can have the products from Western Sahara, from Nagorno-Karabakh, imported as labeled, as made in Morocco or made in Armenia, which indicates that there is no common approach towards imports from these territories. We also see it in the development of interpretation and application of the preferential trade agreements that the EU has with the territories that claim sovereignty over these regions. So the European Court of Justice way back was very clear in the British judgments that it's the EU agreement with Palestinian authorities and not the EU agreement with Israel that would apply to imports from Israeli settlements. However, we see that despite the judgments in Polisario, the case with Western Sahara is different. So the council kind of couple of years went ahead and still stretched the association agreement of EU and Morocco to the products that are imported from Western Sahara, but are under Moroccan kind of jurisdiction. And of course, we had very recently on the 21st of September, the new judgment of the General Court saying that this isn't legal because the Sahrawi population wasn't really consulted, probably. So in my ongoing analysis, which builds on my previous research and which would hopefully result in eventually a new paper and an updated version of my old paper, I look at three things. So I analyzed trade with these territories based on three lenses. So I looked how the territory is conceptualized in the trade agreements that the EU has with the territories that claim sovereignty over these regions, with states claiming sovereignty over these regions. Look how rules of origins are defined in this agreement and whether there are specific certifications or authorizations needed to export these products to the EU and to which states do these authorities belong. And I also look at technical customs measures such as labeling, certificates of origin, and so on, which the EU applies for the imports. And I kind of tried to conceptualize my findings in this table, which still needs to be updated, but which I think allows for some interesting observations. So, for instance, you see when we look at the preferential trade agreements, we see very clear that in case of the EU, it's in case of Israeli settlements, it's the Palestinian free trade agreement which applies. In case of Crimea, it's the agreement with Ukraine that will apply. While the situation with Western Sahara, is slightly different because technically de facto the Morocco agreement will apply, and also the court kind of mentioned, and a lot of critique of the court's judgments later as well mentioned that the agreement there applies de facto. Well, the case of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is, of course, the preferential trade agreement is not applicable anymore since Cyprus is the member of the EU. But before that, we also had a line of cases about the free trade agreements. It's interesting how the agreements define the territorial scope, because the EU is very clear that what they mean by, when you look at the EU and Israel Association Agreement, what they mean by the territory of Israel. They do refer to international law. The EU very often in its policy documents mention that it's the territory before the 1967 war, which it considers as Israel. So that Israel acknowledged and accepted international borders. But in the other agreements, if you look at them, they're very vague in how they describe the territory. And the same with the rules of origin. We see that some agreements would require specific authorization from the authorities of countries. For instance, in Ukraine, you technically could import Crimean products into the EU if the Ukrainian authority issues the certificate of origin. But in practice, of course, that's very difficult because the Ukrainian authorities would have no incentives whatsoever to issue certificates of origin for products that are made by Russian companies in an annexed territory. So this is an interesting kind of disconnect between what the agreement requires and what the reality is. The same with labeling practices. I already mentioned it a bit earlier. So there is a very strong labeling requirements, especially after the Psago case, for products imported from Israeli settlements. There are no similar requirements to products from Western Sahara or products from Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. I didn't find any policy documents for either Nagorno-Karabakh or Crimea. However, on the European market, you can find products that are imported from Crimea, which are labeled as made in Crimea, Russia, which, for instance, the Crimean champagne, which is a very interesting development in my point of view, and the same for Nagorno-Karabakh. So indeed, what we see here is that there is no really a common approach that the EU maintains towards trade with these territories when it comes to the technical measures and when it comes to rules of origins. And this kind of can mean two things. So there are two takeaways that I'm kind of taking now from this ongoing research. First is that the EU treatment of products is different, so that Israeli products are treated different than products from other countries. And this creates the danger that the EU is kind of shaping its trade policy through arguably discriminatory customs measures. And there have been even academic and policy papers suggesting that, well, it's not in line with international trade law, it's not in line with the rules of the WTO law, and also some voices that actually were suggesting Israel to seek consultations at the WTO dispute settlement with the EU after the Psagot judgment. And this is another topic I'm currently working at, and I didn't want to, because of time, to tell much about it now, but I did want to mention a few things, is that once we start talking about this potential discrimination, we inevitably start comparing these territories. And then the question is, of course, to what extent, is it fair what we're comparing? Is the situation in Palestine the same as in Western Sahara or not? And it's a very sensitive topic. It also leads to sensitive policies. It also leads to various politically sensitive statements. So, for instance, one of the things that the EU policy is that the EU is continuously mentioning in its policies is that, well, there is an agreement between Palestine and the EU, but there is no agreement between the EU and Sahrawi Republic. So, Sahrawi Republic is actually would not benefit from any possible trade with the EU unless you apply the Morocco agreement. And the second issue is, of course, the role of the EU as a global trade actor and also as a supporter of international law. So without this common approach, you can also argue, and there have been many papers that argue that the EU kind of uses international law very selectively, and that the cases which could have been decided in the area of trade policy, for instance, like the recent Psago case, which was decided based on consumer law with a very slight reference to international law, that the EU kind of shines away from these trade discussions and to bring politics into trade. I stop here. Many thanks for having me again, and I'm looking forward for any comments or suggestions.
Thank you very much. A wonderful and very interesting presentation, and I also think a very fascinating research topic. I'm sure it triggers a lot of questions. Also, thank you very much for being perfectly in time, because you presented in 11 minutes and 58 seconds. So that's a very, very good on time. So thank you. We'll return you to your paper later on. I now want to give the floor to Cornelia. Cornelia, do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, I do. Let me share it with you. Share screen. Okay, share.
There it is.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it very well.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I am very glad to be here, especially after the previous year where we had zero chances of presenting our research due to the COVID restraints, and the online conferences were not as popular as they are now. So I'm very happy to present to you a part of the research of last year, which represents the last part of my PhD, so the last chapter. It concerns a case study that I studied as part of regulatory cooperation results. Although in my PhD chapter the scope is broader, in that for that particular presentation I chose to focus on the case study of chemicals and discuss whether the regulatory dialogue can be as far-reaching as to push over the edge of constitutional principles. A little bit on the agenda before delving into the details. I will first refer to the greater context of regulatory cooperation and how it has been implemented so far. And then I will go to the specific case study on chemicals, and I will explain how from either leaked documents or official documents from the Commission, we see how the regulatory dialogue has impacted the revision of two specific legislations. And later on, I will turn to discuss some legitimacy issues and whether the constitutional general principles of EU law can act as limits to this to the results that we will see. So let me start by presenting the regulatory cooperation chapters, a very contested issue during the past years, especially after their inclusion in the TTIP. We have seen that after TTIP, they have been included also in CETA and EU-Japan, and a lot of academic literature has focused and has pointed out potential legitimacy issues that could arise from them. However, till now, we didn't have any specific case studies that could either give justice or not to the speculations. What I've been doing in my research is that I have been trying to look on the actual results and see whether these hypotheses stand or not. What is interesting in that respect is to mention that even though there was a hype about regulatory cooperation and its results, there is actually an absence of secondary decision-making in the regulatory cooperation fora, which are the joint structures that are established under the regulatory cooperation chapters. There is a decision-making, there is an absence of a decision-making mandate, both in the regulatory cooperation fora as such, the specialized committees, but also there is an absence of binding decision-making in the joint committees, which are the overarching committees established both in CETA and EU-Japan EPA. So that raises effectively the questions. So if there is no decision-making, how are these results going to be implemented? Thankfully, we have had some results in the CETA. And there has been what I would like to call a substitution of this rulemaking by either ad hoc agreements like administrative agreements or not, or also regulatory dialogue that is not as it is not as tangible, but has tangible effects in the EU legislation and beyond. So in my research, I've been focusing both on the administrative agreements that have been signed by DG Health and the DG Health of Canada, but also the DG of Justice and Consumers of the European Commission, and various administrative arrangements supporting the CETA protocol on pharmaceuticals. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I will now turn to regulatory dialogue and its effect onto the chemicals legislation, in particular its revision. So in the last years, there has been the revision of two major chemicals legislations: the regulation on PPP, so plant product protection, and also regulation of the MRLs. To give a little bit of background on what these regulations do, so the first one is actually on the authorization of the active substances in the European Union and operationalizes the risk assessment. So it sets the criteria which active substances will be allowed in the EU market. It is, as a regulation, it is based on the precautionary principle under the assumption that should one active substance be judged as hazardous, then it is automatically not allowed in the European markets. So there is not risk assessment on the basis of the presented risks, but once it is judged hazardous on the basis of the precautionary principle, it is automatically excluded. On the other hand, the regulation on the MRLs concerns the tolerance of the residue levels of these active substances that are eventually allowed on the basis of the PPP regulation, and on or in food that is circulated in the European market. They are, as you can imagine, complementary, so that this is the reason why they have been also revised simultaneously. However, on the basis of this revision, it has come to our attention through some leaked documents provided by Foodwatch, how a certain big pressure has been exerted by Canada and by also big lobbying industries to the Commission to abandon this stance. So, as you can imagine, in the context of the PPP regulation, when a substance is just hazardous, it is discontinued. However, this development, and so it cannot be an MRL tolerance level cannot be set. This, however, was not taken very lightly, but by our Canadian trade partners, and they lobbied very hard on the Commission, with their long-term goal being to move away from this hazard-based cutoff criteria as a basis for this decision and switch to a risk assessment part. As you can see, I have here presented some parts of what this leaked documents suggest, which is actually taken from the Canadians' part. The European Union's implementation of a hazard-based regulatory decision-making under the PPP regulation threatens the continued market access of Canadian exports of agricultural commodities valued over $2.7 million Canadian dollars annually. I have also provided the link below should you want to look into more details in these documents. After this development, of course, it was my next step in my research was to go and see whether, once the revision of these the regulations was finished, to see which policy direction was taken eventually. And to my surprise, I found out that the revision had abandoned the initial stance of the EU Commission, which was for the complete deletion of MRLs for substances considered hazardous. Of course, both for imported both for imported products and products produced internally, which is according to the letter of the law. And they provided certain some justifications to it, that there is criticism from stakeholders, farmers, and the public that farmers in the EU face unfair competition compared to EU countries because import tolerances can be set for active substances that are not approved in the EU. With this statement, basically, they admit that indeed they have caved into the pressure of the trade partners in the big industry, and they have allowed actually for an MRL to be set for active substances which in the EU are discontinued discontinued because they are just hazardous. So as we can see, there is a kind of an imbalance between unfair treatment, if you want, between imported and produced internally products. And in more legal terms, we would say that this abandonment with regard to the imported products constitutes an output legitimacy issue in the respect that it moves away from the precautionary principle, which is a general principle of EU law of constitutional status that has to be adhered to during the decision making in these matters. The question that I then turn to after having identified this problem is whether the precautionary principle as such in legal terms could set limits to the compatibility of the regulatory dialogue and its impact in the EU legal order. I start by questioning whether there is a general compatibility on the first level of the input from regulatory dialogue with the Commission's right of initiative, and I find out that there is not. It was both confirmed through some landmark jurisprudence of the Court of Justice on an earlier case on regulatory cooperation, but it is also mandated by law on Article 11 on the requirement to conduct consultations. So the regulatory dialogue is actually sought after throughout the regulatory framework of the EU. So in principle, we do not have any clash. However, when there are some other, the precautionary principle as a general principle of EU law and as a regulatory value with constitutional status can set limits to this compatibility. As on its virtue as such, it would be breached if the Commission decided to move away from a hazard-based approach to a more risk-based one when it does not so for products produced internally, and it does it only for the trade partners. My argument is that the precautionary principle can act as a limit to the compatibility of this regulatory pressure exerted by the trade partners, because it, on the basis of its value as constitutional principle by reference in its primary law, its elevation to a general principle by the European Court of Justice on several instances, but also through its migration to other regulatory areas. And after having positively assessed that it can act as a limit and it should act as a limit, the question that comes naturally after is how we can remedy these output legitimacy threats and actually control and be able to assess that that a certain issue presents a risk. We need control mechanisms, and honestly, in the regulatory cooperation chapters, these are absent. To begin with, I call them throughput legitimacy mechanisms. I have borrowed this terminology, output and throughput, through classic literature on law and political sciences on legitimacy. Throughput legitimacy, the way I view it, represents the various administrative procedures and guarantees that guarantee interest intermediation with the people. So there is a certain interest intermediation with a group of stakeholders that is balanced and that can act as a backstop to the exerted regulatory pressure by big industries that have, let's say, a lobbying advantage. These control mechanisms, according to my opinion, should be based on the procedural legitimization, let's say, landmarks of EU law: openness, transparency, and participation requirements, which are enshrined in Articles 15 TFEU and 11 TEU. In the EU, these values constitute constitutional yardsticks for the totality of EU's governance, so not only for internal rulemaking, but they equally extend to external rulemaking activities as well. However, as I mentioned before, their absence from the treaty level, particularly from the regulatory cooperation level, is striking, as, for example, in those chapters, both in CETA and EU-Japan, the only requirements for transparency concern either internal transparency requirements or transparency and consultation requirements at the rulemaking stage. So not at the decision-making stage of regulatory cooperation committees, but only internally when the EU or Canada or Japan wants to initiate some new legislation. So actually, what is taking place within these joint committees and within the regulatory dialogue that is taking place within these structures is not somehow controlled and is not subject to these legitimizing requirements. And in that respect, I propose that a certain solution to that problem would be to extend the domestic advisory groups, which are present in CETA and EU-Korea FTA, with regard, however, to other chapters, also to regulatory cooperation. The domestic advisory groups are certain groups of.
You have one more minute.
Thank you. I'm actually at the end.
Okay.
There are certain groups that to which various stakeholders participate. A balanced representation of interest participates, and they are actually under the guidance of the Economic and European Economic Social Committee. So the proposal would be to extend that to regulatory cooperation, however, by revising, of course, the consultation procedure in order to make it more effective and ensure proper checks and balances. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for your presentation and introducing your research on regulatory cooperation. That actually reminds me about regulatory cooperation. We talk very much about harmonizing standards. And you might not know that, but every year we celebrate a Standards Day. And that's today on the 14th of October. So we have Happy Standards Day. Let's go to the final presentation of today. And welcome Sophie Meunier to talk about the big screen, mapping the diffusion of foreign investment screening mechanisms. Will you be using a PowerPoint?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Okay, so if I find it, there we go.
There we go. All right, thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So let me start here. Sorry, hold on. I cannot see slideshow. Okay, here we go from beginning. Okay, can you see now? Well, good.
Yes. We can see very well.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for inviting me. First, I apologize that my co-author, Sarah Barley-Dantzman, is not with me today. We have written a paper that actually really ties back to the introduction that Professor Wouters gave this morning. So our paper is not specifically about the EU, but you will see that it really ties in to what we've been talking about. So it's called the Big Screen, Mapping the Diffusion of Foreign Investment Screening Mechanisms. And that's where we start right away with the link to the introduction. And I'll take you back to Jean-Claude Juncker, then president of the Commission, who said in his State of the European Union in 2017, "We are not naive free traders. Europe must always defend its strategic interests." And this end of naivete speech really marks a shift, that, as we've heard, especially in the first panel, really marks a shift in EU political and ideological views towards free trade and globalization. It's this realization that economic relations can be weaponized, and that the EU, leading by example, which it has been doing through its trade policy for a long time, is really putting it as a disadvantage. So the EU joins other advanced industrial economies in adopting a more assertive or aggressive posture towards globalization to level the playing field. And that includes new defensive and offensive trade and investment policy instruments, including the one that we address in this paper, which is the instrument of investment screening. So just to show you, investment screening is kind of happening. It's a big hot thing right now. It's happening everywhere. So you see here, Australia to toughen its foreign investment law, Trump administration stepping up scrutiny, EU toughens takeover rules, Tokyo eyes tighter for investment screening. So this is happening in all the advanced industrialized democracy economies here. So what are the objectives of our paper? First, we want to show what is new about investment screening today and how and why it's not well explained by traditional international political economy. Second, we want to introduce a brand new data set that we've created called the Politics and Regulation of Investment Screening Mechanisms, PRISM, which is an original data set of patterns and features of investment screening regulations in all OECD countries since 2007. And then finally, we want to show how this data can be used for analyzing important questions at the nexus between IP and national security, including determinants of investment screening, costs, and more broadly, politics of institutional design. So what is investment screening? It's a practice by which governments review the incoming foreign direct investment and deny entry to, or sometimes require the divestment of investments that are deemed unacceptable. So that's investment screening. An investment screening mechanism, ISM, is a routinized legal process of investment screening on the basis of predetermined criteria. So it's not like a case-by-case basis, a transaction comes in and you say, should we allow that transaction? That's not an ISM. An ISM is you have laws, you have rules, you have bodies that do this in advance. I mean, it's predetermined. It is different from ownership controls, which a lot of countries have, where you say, foreigners cannot invest in this sector, or they cannot invest more than 49% in this sector. Investment screening is different because it is designed to be compatible with being open, liberal investment flows, by allowing all the acceptable transactions while preventing only the entry of the undesirable investors or the sale of specific sensitive assets to foreigners, not like a blanket control. So what's new about investment screening? Well, there used to be screening before in the past, many decades ago, but it was mostly done on economic grounds. So transactions would be reviewed and the criterion is on average, is the transaction bringing us net economic benefits. This is a very restrictive practice when you start not allowing investments because you don't think economically they'll be good. It's very restrictive, and it has been mostly abandoned in most countries except Canada and just a few others. What's new is that the new investment screening is done almost exclusively on national security grounds. And the question there is, does the proposed transaction has a potential to endanger national security? And there's been a proliferation of investment screening measures on security grounds in recent years. So here's just to show you, that's based on actually on our data set. We show you that just since 2008, the number of investment screening mechanism has really, has doubled just in the past 10 years. The EU itself has joined the fray and has created its new EU investment screening framework, which was approved in March 2019. It's been implemented since October of last year. It's not a true investment screening mechanism, and ultimately the decision rests with the country that receives the transaction, but it's probably the first step towards an EU ISM. And there I will refer you to a paper I just published this summer with my student Zenobia Chan, which is specifically about, it came out in the Review of International Organization, and it's specifically about the genesis of the EU investment screening framework. So I'm happy to answer question about how it works and why it was created. Quickly, investment screening and IP theory. We think it poses an apparent puzzle, because how can this reconstruction of inward investment restrictions be compatible with welcoming new investment, which is something countries at the same time that they're putting in place all these measures to screen investment, they're also very hard trying to attract as much investment as they can. Also, domestic business groups support openness, so you don't have like lobbying against that. And then governments are very likely to embrace, we know from past research that governments are very likely to embrace FDI during economic downturns. So for instance, after the financial crisis, the euro crisis, or the COVID crisis. So for all these reasons, countries really want investment, and at the same time, they're putting these measures, these screening measures in place. There is very little literature on investment screening, probably because until recently, it was a rare phenomenon, and also because everything about them is highly secretive, so you cannot have access to what's going on in the review process itself. It's not well explained by traditional IPE model that emphasize factor-based interest groups or that see investment politics as a battle between all kinds of groups, so exporter versus importers, or large firms versus small firms, or different parties. Actually, if you look at support for investment screening laws in recent years, it has been bipartisan. Even in the US, where nothing is bipartisan these days, but the FIRMA, the law that updated the US screening mechanism, has been entirely bipartisan. And most of the recent academic literature on this has been focused mostly on investment screening in China and mostly on Chinese investment in the US. So there's really not a lot about Europe. Okay, so briefly, our data set. We think that the first step towards this new theorizing about these new rules of investment is better data on the mechanisms themselves. And it's not all or nothing. It's not that the country has a mechanism or it doesn't. There's a lot of variation in what these measures cover. So that's what we do in our PRISM dataset, is to specifically look at the variation and code these variation across a range of characteristics that include the scope, how many sectors and business are covered, the thresholds, how large of a stake and how large the transaction has to be to trigger review, foreign government control, whether, if you have a foreign government owning, making the transaction, does it automatically trigger review, whether there is a net benefit test, whether you need pre-approval, who's empowered to monitor or enforce this, and finally, who is actually doing the screening, whether it's the whole government or a specific agency. So we have data. I'm just showing you what it looks like, but so we have data on all of these for 38 countries. Just to let you know, today, as much as 60%, the OECD estimate that 60% of all global FDI flows are potentially subject to national security related review. So it's a big deal. And our data set helps to answer some basic descriptive questions about what investment screening regulations look like, how they compare across different country contexts, and how they have changed over time. So 4 observations that we make. The first is indeed that there's been a marked increase in the passage of investment review mechanisms and update to existing law in recent years, almost all of them on national security. Actually, during our time frame, there's been 12 brand new screening mechanisms. And in the EU, when the EU started the process in 2017, there were only 11. There are 18 now and probably 21 by next year. Second observations is that ISMs have increased their scope of coverage over time, both through cross-sectoral instruments and through the expansion of sectors covered. So there's 7 countries in the time frame that have expanded the scope. And here, you can see that's another thing we use the data for, to show you the expansion of sectors that are covered. Some countries like France, started with 5 sectors that are covered and then gradually moved to 10 and 12 and 15. So that's what's captured here. The third observation is that investment screening reviews increasingly smaller transactions. It used to be only for big deals, and now it's like, smaller ones, measured both in terms of absolute valuation, so how much is the deal, and also as a percentage of the deal size. And in our data, we show 8 countries that have lower thresholds. And finally, the last observation is that there's a growing convergence over time among the mechanism paths, and we show convergence among towards like 3 types. So finally, last slide, we, in the paper, actually in the revision of the paper, not the one I sent you, but we really show different questions that could be beyond the narrow focus on ISMs that could be asked and answered by using these data. So the first type of questions are the one having to do with investment screening itself. So is it a response to popular backlash against globalization? Is it a response to the blurring between economy and security? Is it a response to geopolitical transformation, especially the rise of China? The second type of questions have to do with the costs and the implications of doing investment screening in an open economy. And the third questions have to do with institutional design questions. And we want to know, especially if convergence is happening through diffusion or through competition. We want to look at principal agent dynamics to figure out whether different ways of structuring review leads to different outcomes. And finally, how do different legal systems incorporate national security regulation in different ways? And does it matter to outcomes? So thank you very much. Again, I'm happy to answer in the Q&A more questions about the EU specifically, but that's the research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and I also think for opening up a whole new area for research, and I think it's a fascinating area. I would now like to go into the Q&A, and I've seen that Wolfgang already raised his hand, so I'm going to give him the floor in a second. But I will also invite the attendees, if they have questions, they can send them to us to the Q&A chat box, and then I will feed them into the discussion. Wolfgang, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie, for your very interesting presentation. And my question relates to the European Union mechanism. Indeed, it's not a real screening mechanism in itself, but only sets out certain rules for the member states to follow. But my question, of course, would be the EU, as it tries to have a common framework insofar. Is it a front runner or a late comer in your research, as you have looked for these mechanisms globally? And related to this question, if you compare the EU mechanism to others which you have seen, can you already make a statement on how different it is regarding to its scope or the measures providing? Is the EU particularly concerned with specific issues? So that's my very open, very broad question to you. I would like to hear more information about that, as far as you can answer it, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. If I may, a very quick follow-up question related to the one of Wolfgang. You mentioned that there are several EU member states who have an investment screening mechanism. And I was wondering whether to what degree these different EU member states mechanisms are converging, diverging, whether they split out over the different types you already identified in your research. Now I hand over to Patricia. Patricia, you also had a question?
Yes, thank you. I have two questions, if I may, one for Sophie and the other one for Ollie. The one for Sophie is related with the ones we have already regarded. Do you think that one of the factors that may be leading to this increased use of ESM has to be the technological race, the fourth industrial revolution? In the sense, have you noticed that most of the cases have to do with technological issues? Thank you. And for Ollie, I was wondering whether this European Union approach, which is not very consistent for those territories, is consistent with European Union foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline, you had a question?
Yes, thank you so much. My question was actually pretty similar to Patricia's. I wrote down, I was interested whether you've looked into that, whether the EU or the Commission have given it a lot of thought not to have a consistent approach due to foreign policy objective. Like, is there a lack of a discussion within the Commission, or is there actually a discussion where they did choose to continue with this, inconsistent strategy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also had a related question to Olia on the EU approach, and you observed that there's a lot of variation. And of course, you're a legal scholar and not a political scientist, but when there is variation, we always wonder, what is explaining this? Is there a role of the European Parliament which plays a role? Is it indeed that it's aligned with foreign policy priorities and these types of things? So I wonder if you can say a bit more on that. And then maybe a question also to Cornelia. Cornelia, we had to be sure at the end of your presentation but you made a very interesting proposal to establish domestic advisory groups to, let's say, be involved in these regulatory cooperation types of mechanisms. Now, in other parts of trade agreements, like trade and sustainable development chapters, domestic advisory groups have been so far been criticized for not being very effective, for not really contributing much. And I was wondering a little bit why you would like to, or why you would think that inserting that mechanism in other chapters might work well there. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And then a final question to Sophie, if I may. Do you have any data on the application of the investment screening mechanisms, in the sense to what investments they are applied, magnitude, sectors, and these types of things? So with these questions, I hand now back to the panel for their comments and reflections. And I propose we follow the same order, and I give first Olya the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's like all 4 are great questions, and they're also questions I've been thinking about, and they're also questions I don't really have like a straightforward answer to be really honest. So starting with Patricia's question, whether the EU approach is consistent with the EU foreign policy in general, it's a very interesting question, and not claiming that I know all the ins and outs of the EU foreign policy. I mean, there is, if we look at the trade, at least if we look at occupied and disputed territories, if we looked at the trade approach, it is consistent with the EU position, for instance, towards Israel, and then the EU position towards Western Sahara, and then the EU position towards the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which EU very much kind of tries to unify with Cyprus, with the Republic of Cyprus, with the Cyprus island. So I would say this trade policy is consistent in with how the EU approaches these territories, but this inconsistency perhaps indeed spans over trade policy and also to other areas. And the follow-up of Caroline's question is whether there's a lack of discussion of it in the Commission. There hasn't been that much discussion. There are questions asked to the Parliament whether, for instance, the PSAGO case shouldn't be also applicable to Western Sahara, and why the Western Sahara situation, and why is that the European consumers are misled if the products are made in occupied territories of Palestine are labeled as made in Israel, but they're apparently not misled, or misled to a less extent when they're made in Western Sahara and they're labeled as made in Morocco. So at least it was a question that was put forward to the Parliament, to the European Parliament a couple of times, and the answer they gave wasn't really satisfactory to my opinion. But one of the things they actually keep mentioning is that lack of agreement between the Sahrawi Republic and the European Union on one side, and the presence of the agreement with Palestinian territories and European Union on the other side. At the same time, now we're like talking about European policy towards the region, and there was also a question in the chat about the Eurasian Economic Union Council. So, for instance, with regard to the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, the EU was very much criticized for a very long time to not kind of providing a policy statement, to not implementing any sanctions against the violations of human rights that happened repeatedly in the regions from both parties. So you also see that in some regions, EU for some reason would like more to be involved than in the others. And coming also to Axel's question about what explains this difference, it's an interesting question. I don't dare to say what really explains this difference. Is it the EU strategic interest? Because of course it's very easy to claim that, well, the EU is more interested for the Northern Cyprus to be united with Cyprus than for resolving the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh because of the proximity. So I don't really have a clear answer to that yet, but it's a very interesting question, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Olya. Cornelia?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. Actually, it's a great opportunity to elaborate a bit on that part, since due the lack of time at the presentation, I couldn't properly address those issues. Of course, I'm aware of that the functioning of the domestic advisory groups in the other chapters, trade labor, trade, sustainable development, etc., has not been optimal, and this is due to a number of reasons. First of all, the selection system of participants by the Commission remains rather opaque. There is a lack of political and bureaucratic support also with regard to the organization of the meetings and the coordination of the participants. And of course, there is no mechanism that ensures that the advice that is received is actually, that the receiver of this advice is held accountable. And of course, I think that all these shortcomings are easily to be, or at least can be addressed. I don't know if it is easily, but they can be addressed through the revision of the rules of procedure and the revision of a selection system that would be monitored by the by the European Economic and Social Committee rather than by the Commission. That can be more transparent. Maybe also establish a rotation system between the participants in order to ensure balanced representation of interests. And the most important thing, of course, is to ensure a system of check and balances in order to ensure that the Commission, that the joint committees of the Commission, etc., does take into account the advice received or not. But yeah, these are definitely points of that some progress has to be made. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Sophie.
Okay, so many questions. First of all, I'll cope out by saying that a lot of the answers actually you can find in the paper behind the screen that we published this summer that really goes through the genesis of the mechanism. So to answer some of the questions. So first, about Wolfgang's question about whether the EU is a latecomer or not. Yeah, it is absolutely a latecomer to the game. The US has had a mechanism since the 1970s, which has changed many times since, as we document in the data set, but it's been there since the 70s. Canada, Australia, they've done it since the 80s. Germany started its own in, I think, 2004, France in 2006. So the EU is coming late to the game. There's some reasons why it is coming late. The first one, as always in EU stories, is one of competence. It did not have competence over foreign investment until the Lisbon Treaty, and even with the Lisbon Treaty, as many of you know, the competence issue was not settled, and it took many years of going back and forth between the member states, the court, etc., to settle. So now it's clear the EU can do this. And change its approach with that end of naivete speech, in 2017. So started the process in 2017, and it is such a latecomer that the US itself has been really trying to lobby for years. They've been trying to lobby the EU to do something. And I'm currently writing a paper with Sarah, my co-author for today, and also with Christila Røder-Rinning of Southern Denmark. We're writing a paper on this, precisely on the role of the US in helping to create the EU one. Patricia's point about the technological race, the second reason besides competence why the EU is doing it now, let's be honest, has to do with China. And the surge of Chinese investment throughout the past decade in the world and in Europe in particular. Again, the main argument in the paper behind the screen that I did this summer is that's really the main argument of the paper, is that the only explanation for different member states' position on this has to do with technology. So the countries that have been pushing for this very strongly are countries that do have something to lose if China comes and buys the technology. The countries that don't have much technology to take, in the first place, they did not really have a beef in its game. They were not so involved. So what really explains the intensity of the preference of some of the member states for creating this at the EU level was how much technology they have. How it works. So right now, it's really a very loose framework because it's the lowest common denominator that the member states could agree on. You basically had France and Germany who wanted this very, very strongly. and lobbied the Commission very hard, and the Commission was on board after 2017. And then you had everybody else who was against it. And so then it was a question of how they convinced these different disparate groups. You know, you had groups that really needed the money, like Greece or Portugal, so they didn't want the screening. And then you had groups where ideologically opposed to any type of screening, you know, because they are free traders and liberals. And then you had groups that love investment and, you know, who knows what they do with investment, like Cyprus or Luxembourg or Ireland. So they didn't want. So anyway, you had different groups like that. And the lowest common denominator they finally got to was a very loose framework of cooperation, consultation, and sharing of information. So now there's a whole procedure that when you receive an investment from a foreign, investor, you have to notify the European Commission and you have to notify the other member states. And they have a very tight deadline during which they can actually review what's going on and then share after the notification, they can tell the country, well, you know, we're really concerned about this particular investment. Are you sure you want to receive it? The Commission has created a whole unit in DG Trade, a brand new unit with 16 people that deals with that, and they're probably going to add more. But as a result of that, and that ties to one of the other questions about whether we see any convergence inside the EU, as a result of that, a lot of countries that did not have an ISM in Europe are now doing one, so they can go, you know, be on board with that notification process, reviewing of other. Okay. The question about whether we have any data on that. Stay tuned next month, because next month the Commission is coming up with a one-year report. So the whole thing is completely secret. So there's absolutely, you know, it's airtight. It's the same way in every country. In the US, you have no idea what's going on inside CFIUS. So it's completely airtight in Europe, but they are going to come up with their one-year report that's going to at least say, this is how many transactions have been reviewed, you know, this is where they were coming from, the countries they were coming from. Last point, if I may, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work I've been doing with Eric Jones and Dan Kellerman on failing forward. But if you are, I think this is an example of failing forward that we will see in a few years, because I can almost with certainty predict that this framework is going to create a crisis where you will have a country that gets an investment and all the other countries that kind of gang up against it and say, this is too dangerous, you cannot accept that investment. And the country will say, I do what I want, you cannot force me. And that's going to create some kind of crisis that will lead, I think, then to the creation of a true European screening mechanism at that point. But we're not there yet.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for a wonderful panel, but very rich and very interesting research presented. We will look very much forward also to the continuation of the research, because you outlined quite a lot of future tracks for research. So that's great. This concludes the first day of our two-day workshop. I want to thank all participants very much for joining us and for the presenters for really presenting excellent papers. We continue the virtual workshop tomorrow, and we start again at 1:15. You can tune in a little bit earlier, but we start at 1:15 sharp. And then we will have two other panels, one focusing more on the broader sustainability issues, COVID-19 consequences and so on. And the last one on democratization, legitimization of EU trade policy. We will end tomorrow with a keynote speech by Professor Alice de Jong, who will give us his insights on the new open assertive trade strategy of the European Commission. So thank you all very much, and I hope to see you all back tomorrow at 1:15. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.